Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, it's Patrick and we're back with more of the great everything. So, in the break since the last segment, I got a few text messages and a few Facebook contacts outraged that I had referred to today, the 4th of May, as Star Trek Day. Lol. You should really know me better. First of all, listen to the segment. Dr. Spock? Come on. TJ Hooker? Admiral Adama from Battlestar Galactica, who isn't even an admiral? I was trolling you. More importantly, shame on you guys. I've been reading comics for 3 decades now, and I'd expect a little more credit and much more respect, given that thanks to your shitty franchise, I had to sit through 5 hours of Hayden Christensen's quote, acting. So, guys, come on, what are we even talking about? Anyway, back to philosophical topics. Yesterday I talked a little bit about moral relativism, and I asked the question, to what extent can we today judge the moral standing of cultures and peoples in past generations who didn't adhere to our own moral standards? And about this, my friend Mark called in with a few great questions. For those of you who don't know, Mark is either the other half of thegreateverything.com or just a figment of my imagination. I'll let you decide. Anyway, he had some fantastic and oh shit, did something just move by itself in my flat? Yep, it most definitely did. Okay, that's weird. But, okay, fine. I'm going to leave you with his questions and I'm going to respond in the next segments. Take it away, Mark.
Patrick, I don't have anything to add to the Star Trek debate because I don't know who Admiral Obama, the BJ Hooker, Jed the Knight, or Dr. Spook are. But I was intrigued by your point on morality and specifically how we judge morality across the ages. You'll probably have seen in the news that in New Orleans at the moment, they have been ordered to tear down statues honouring big Confederate figures. Obviously this is happening kind of all over the US at the moment, but I raise New Orleans as a place that's dear to both of us and as a place that I exiled myself to when I quit corporate law in London back in 2015. So yeah, they've been ordered to tear down these statues, presumably on the basis that these are figures who, on the point of slavery specifically, did nothing to end the phenomenon of slavery. I wondered how, on that specific point, you judge people who were in favour of slavery, 200 odd or more years ago when it was really at its most rampant. My understanding is that your argument, which makes sense to me, is look, we should judge people according to the best widely available moral viewpoint or argument of that time. Now, back in the day of slavery, there were plenty of people, slaves and also non-slaves, who would have presented compelling arguments against slavery from a moral point of view. They were either ignored or actively shut down, for want of a better word. I guess my question is, how do you define the sort of the frontier between a widely available moral argument and a not widely available enough moral argument? Because it strikes me that back then it was pretty widely available. And the second question is, on the back of that, on this specific case, would you come down for or against the tearing down of these statues?
Thank you, Mark. It's always nice to hear from you when you're not just calling in to post fart noises. Yeah, for those of you who don't know, and that's literally everyone, Mark and I made it through most of Okay, so we're talking about our ability to morally evaluate the actions of people in the past. And Mark at TGE, who's the other half of my blog, thegreateverything.com, has called in with a bunch of fascinating questions that have really forced me to refine my views. So I'm going to respond to these questions in separate segments. And this is the first one. How do I view, from a moral standpoint, people who were in favor of slavery in America in the 1800s? Before answering, a couple of points. I think it's important to make a distinction and talk about how we morally evaluate these people's stance on slavery rather than how do we evaluate them. So we're evaluating their moral decisions in respect of slavery rather than their moral standing as human beings. Well, this is for a number of reasons. The first one is because I don't find it fair or intelligent for me to pass judgment on a person's character without having a slightly fuller picture of their actions. Because, look, I know it's easy to say that there are certain cardinal sins and beliefs that you can hold and they just disqualify you as a moral agent, but I don't think that's true. We are complex creatures and we inhabit vast grey areas of morality. And beyond the most extreme acts, such as intentionally causing severe harm to an innocent person, I don't think there's a single belief or action that can give me a full picture on a person's character or moral stature. If the only thing you knew about me was that once I lied to my mother so that she would buy me 2 Conan the Barbarian comics instead of just the one, you might think I'm a very dishonest person. Because you know a bit more about me, and Mark specifically knows a lot more about me, all those things just go on the balancing scale of who I am and the things I've done. And the second reason is I don't accept that a person's opinions or beliefs are what make them moral or immoral. It's their actions. I think it's perfectly possible to hold reprehensible opinions and yet still be a good person. I've met neo-Nazis who were ultimately good people and who, had they seen me get hit by a car, they would have helped, and they wouldn't have stopped to ask whether I was a Jew first, and they wouldn't have stopped helping me had they found out I was a Jew. But all that said, I see the choice by an American in the 1800s to be in favor of slavery as an immoral choice. And there are a number of reasons for this. First of all, that other nations had already begun to either abolish slavery or were at least having that conversation, which means that the arguments against slavery were widely available to almost anyone in the West. Additionally, look, we're already 200 years after philosophers like John Locke. The Enlightenment ideals were widespread. The notion that human beings are individuals with individual rights was not only established in the West, it was a bedrock of American independence. And finally, I'd also note that there are a few things I can think of that are more absurd than a Christian being actively in favor of slavery, given Christ's message of universal love and brotherhood. So yes, I'd see an American in 1800 who supported slavery as someone who, on that topic, had adopted an immoral choice. Okay, we're still on the second of 3 questions asked by Mark at TGE, the other half of thegreateverything.com. And this question is how I view the tearing down of the statues depicting Confederate leaders in New Orleans. Before we go ahead, user discretion is advised because my opinion on this is incredibly ill-informed. B, it's not really an opinion because I genuinely don't have strong feelings about it. And C, whatever I say is more likely than not to be controversial. Because, look, there'd be nothing in the world that would be easier for me than to just say, it's a travesty that these statues are up, these are horrible people, they stand for a terrible repressive system, so we need to tear them down. That would be very easy, everyone would agree with me, it would be great, people would share my content, I get applause, we could all line up to give each other blowjobs because of how hard we agree. But another way of saying that is that it's a boring opinion. It's not the wrong opinion, but it is a boring one, because it's the one all the people with degrees have. And the way I'm structured is I like to look at things from the different point of view. And guess what? Okay, how do I view the tearing down of the statues? Well, I don't really know. On the one hand, I don't like it because I think that a sense of history is important. And statues don't have to be about celebrating a figure, they can just be a reminder of what happened. And these things happened. These people existed and they were important. So while I can see removing the statues as a symbolic gesture, like, okay, we've moved on, I also see it in the light of sweeping history under the carpet and pretending it didn't exist. Or worse, book burning. Look, I'm really far removed from these issues, thank Rao, but if I'm giving you my personal feeling about it, when I hear about people removing statues, the image I get in my head isn't a heroic protest like Harvey Milk marching or Gandhi's passive resistance. I think of the Taliban's bombing those statues of the Buddha and Mao cancelling 3,000 years of Chinese history in the Cultural Revolution. I'm not saying they're the same thing, I'm just saying that that's the feeling I get, that's what's in my heart. And these are local landmarks as well. I was reading an interview with a black fellow who spent his childhood meeting his friends and eating sandwiches at the bottom of the statue of Robert E. Lee. On the other hand, I do understand, because what if today Berlin streets were filled with statues of Hitler? Now, I wouldn't want them torn down, but I could see myself being really pissed off if people were leaving flowers there. That said, in Mongolia, they have the face of Genghis Khan plastered all over the place. He's one of the most bloodthirsty dictators in history. He killed far more than Hitler could have ever dreamed of. He's pretty much worshipped there. And how do you feel the families of those 40 million Chinese people he killed would feel about that? We talk about Alexander the Great, the bloodthirsty conqueror who killed countless people in the Middle East, as a hero. And that makes me think, will there come a point where we'll be so far removed from the pain and the suffering these figures caused, where we'll just talk about them in terms of pros and cons? Will there be a time 500 years from now where it'll be totally normal to say, yeah, the Holocaust, but also that Hitler sure got those trains running on time? It's a complex issue, and I don't have any real feelings about the people whose statues are being torn down, so it's hard for me to say. But what I can say is that, as far as our sense of history is concerned, I think it might be a mistake. Now let me run for cover before the responses come. Okay, finally, question 3 of 3. In a previous segment, I said that we can judge the moral value of a choice based on the alternatives available to the person making that choice. And with regard to the choice of a culture at a certain time, a different period, the valid alternative would have been the best moral understanding widely available at that time. And Mark asked, what counts as widely available? A fantastic question, because it forced me to really refine my thinking. The reason I put it in terms of the best moral understanding available to a society is because in that segment I was talking about societies and cultures, etc. But ultimately, societies don't make choices, people do. Britain didn't choose Brexit, 51% of British voters did. Now, nobody would say that I or Mark chose Brexit just because other people in our society did. Okay, so that means we have to look at individual choices, as in the choices of individuals, because choices and intentions are the best basis for evaluating morality on any issue. Fine. I'd say then that what matters is if the best moral understanding of the time is available to you as an individual making a choice. If that understanding, if that info is available and you ignore it, that's immoral. And if it's so widely available that it would take only a minimum amount of effort for you to find it, then that's also a moral choice. That's a choice to stay ignorant, because at any given point there's always a threshold area where it's easy for you to bump into an idea. So if you're not bumping into it, it's because you're staying indoors. It's a willful ignorance. And that too is immoral, I think. And another factor to consider is how pressing the issue is, i.e., where does it sit on the scale of moral issues that need to be resolved as a matter of priority. So in that earlier segment, I gave the example of eating meat. In the 50s, nobody gave a shit about animal rights. You'd eat a steak and the thought might not even occur to you that this might be causing pain and suffering beyond what is acceptable. Nobody would be talking about it either. In that case, I think it's not immoral for you to eat meat. But say you're still in the 50s and you meet an animal rights activist and he explains it to you. Now you can think, okay, I might look into this. And if you do, and you're convinced of the argument, and you still eat meat, then I think that's an immoral choice. However, you might say, I guess it makes sense, but I mean, how bad can it be really? And maybe this guy is just a crackpot. I don't know. Nobody else is talking about it. Now, how you might decide to view that morally depends on how much you expect people to be pioneers in morality. If you do go above and beyond, you're clearly extremely moral, but if you don't, in this case, I'm not going to judge you for not being a saint. Not with all my flaws. But today, in this age, with meat eating, we've clearly reached a point where there's so many people talking about it, and there's so much info that if we're still nonchalantly eating meat, like I do, at the very least, we're avoiding the topic. Because that moral understanding, that best moral understanding, is available to us. So it's a moral decision we're making. But on the other point I made about how pressing it is, there's also an issue about prioritization. You gotta keep in mind the amount of moral conquests that are ahead of us. So say this. Say you live in a society where most people think it's okay to chop off a little girl's genitals because she isn't supposed to have an orgasm. If you were living there, I'd cut you some slack if you told me, dude, let's leave the meat issue to the side for now. I'm still trying to deal with the human rights stuff. So I'd say how we can assess the morality of a person in a certain age depends on 1, the amount and the quality and the availability to that person of moral alternatives. 2, if they're not available, the extent to which he's willfully ignoring them. And 3, the urgency or the priority of that moral issue compared to other moral issues that that person might be contending with.